Hi, I'm Justin Rothshank, and I'm here to invite you to the 12th Annual Michiana Pottery Tour, happening on September 23 and 24 in northern Indiana and southern Michigan. You'll find a list of the more than 50 participating artists, links to their web stores, and more information at www.michianapotterytour.com or on our Instagram page at Michiana Pottery Tour. Michiana Pottery Tour is a program of the new Northern Indiana Clay Alliance. We hope to see you this fall.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 483 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Renata Cassiano. Her ceramic sculptures are non-objective accumulations, often dealing with ideas of connection and translation. In our interview, we talk about reusing older work to create new forms, using a concrete saw to shape fired ceramics, and the influence of literature on her understanding of self and art. Cassiano is currently the visiting assistant professor of art at the University of Arkansas School of Art, which is a powerhouse of ceramics. They have a great program and a brand new facility. So if you're interested in getting an MFA in ceramics, you guys should all check out University of Arkansas. You can find that at uarkceramics.org. If you'd like to see examples of Renata's work, you can go to her website. That's renatacassiano.com. So without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, to start, I wanted to talk about a piece of yours called Time Begins. And in that piece, this was probably 2020, you were giving an artist talk at a show you had at Lucy Lacoste Gallery. And you were talking about this piece, but I think this describes a lot more of your work. And you talked about that there's a beauty when something is falling apart, but also being held together. And that seems to be like a big part of your work, like things that are kind of in the liminal space where you're like, is this being destroyed? Is it being created? What's happening? So can you talk about this piece and that idea as being foundational in your work?
Well, I think, yes, you're correct. Like that idea is, I wouldn't say the main driver of the work, but it is a big part of it. And I think, and I called it Time Begins because like time, I see, so I'm going to go back here a little bit. There's a shape that I am really interested in, which is, I think for people to understand, I wouldn't describe it with this word, but I think this word will let people know exactly what I'm talking about, which is a donut. So this form is present in a lot of Mexican pre-Hispanic found artifacts, found objects. It's the shape of the it's like the goalie, I guess you call it in English, where the ball goes in the ball game that a lot of cultures from pre-Hispanic Mexico used to play. And that shape to me, and it's present in a lot of things, and that shape to me represents time as a thing that just runs. It's like it runs a course that starts and ends at the same spot. So you never see it end or stop. It just keeps going. And I like it more like the infinite, symbol. I'm really responding to this shape. And I think the more I work with it, the more I understand it, which is pretty much like the artistic process. But anyway, so the process of deconstructing and reconstructing and putting it together, and something that you can see the cracks in, and something that it's not hiding, like it's not perfect, and it's not hiding that imperfection, and it's also showing the like the scars of time, the scars of process. To me, it's important that my work shows that, not only because it reconnects it to the archaeological process, that it's like very important in my work, and in the way that I make it, but also that it shows that it goes not it pushes back a little bit on this idea that ceramics is this like perfect uh thing, that it's light, and that it's hollow too. All of my work is solid, like when you carry it you can feel the weight of the material, and I want that. I want for people to not only feel it but also like sense it, you know. And so it's the same thing with this cracks. Like my work, when I take my work out of the kiln, it cracks. When I carve it out of the mold, it cracks even more. Like there is so much reconstruction in it that it makes no sense for me um to try to hide it. It's more like highlighting it, and for people to understand that this was the process, and that this also mirrors the process of our lives and the process of time. Like we are beings that are being broken and put back together constantly. So the same way that archaeological artifacts are, they are broken and then put back together so that we can see them and understand them. So yeah, that's the gist of it, I think.
Yeah, and visually, what happens is that you have these accumulations of either sculptural parts or glaze poured into sculptural parts. You have this idea that like things are going up, but then it feels like sometimes you change the orientation of the work. Like you fire it one way, but then you shift it another way. How is the post firing process? Like, how does that determine the end?
Well, this is very interesting, because I was just talking to a friend about it on, I believe it was Friday, because he was telling me that in my work it looks like the firing, because in ceramics the firing is most of the time like the last thing, right? Like the firing completes the piece. This is when the piece comes out of the kiln, it's finished. So for me, the firing is actually the beginning of the process. After I fire the work, it comes weeks of reconstruction, of first understanding like what the piece is trying to tell me, because my process is very much that way. I intuitively make. I have an idea in my head, I have a vision, I sometimes draw it. But the vision sounds like it presented to me in some sort of dream. But yes, it's kind of like, oh, I see something and I'm like, oh, like I'm responding to that. I should make a piece about that, right? And responding to an impulse. And then I make the piece, and I make the mold. It's not a secret how I make it. Like I make a mold, and then I pour the glaze into it with other stuff that I think would be interesting. And then I call it excavation, because sometimes I have to excavate it out of the kiln. There's a lot of like accidents that happen, so I need to excavate it out of the kiln, and that really many times messes up with the original idea. So there's a lot of letting go here, which is like a life's lesson as well. So I excavate it out of the kiln, I start to carve it, and that's when the piece starts telling me like, you had this idea, but actually, why don't we try this, right? So it's always a collaboration with the idea, with the material, with the process. And then that's when I start understanding how like the piece also works better, because I think that we always have to be ready again to let go of what we originally wanted, and just flow with what is presented to you now, because I think that presents also opportunities. That there's a lot of opportunities in failure, and in my work there's a lot of failure. Like I don't think maybe people actually see it, but it is a lot of like, okay, this didn't work, this broke, let's see how we can do it again. So yes, there is a lot of changing of orientation, there is a lot of like adding and subtracting, there is a lot of changing, there is a lot of refiring, there is a lot of gluing, there's a lot of things. And yes, the firing is really just the beginning of the process. There is a lot of that happens post-firing.
One of the pieces or groups of pieces I saw you reference, you were calling them flags, and they were small, kind of vertical pieces that had been cut with a concrete saw to make them four-cornered. So the bottom looked square, and some of them actually set up on almost like a quadrupod like base. But then the top was the uncut glaze. So you have this cut surface beside a beautifully what we would think of as a glazed surface. So how did you get into using a concrete saw to cut these planes into the work?
I started experimenting with that. It first started when I lived in Denmark. I worked at the Gulego, the research center, for a couple of years, and there I started. I would work with all of these artists that had a very experimental approach. This was like I was right out of undergrad. Like I had graduated, I don't know, a couple years, and I was getting in contact with like artists from all over the world that had visions of the material, like very different ones. And I started questioning my own ideas about ceramics and about what it can do and about the opportunities and how it can mirror language. So I started thinking about those things there, and I started messing around a little bit with glaze. And then when I went back to Mexico, I started also wondering, like, how could you shape glaze into a form and make it the form itself? So I started working with that idea, but with slips, low fire slips. And then a couple of years later, when I was in grad school, I went more seriously into that thought, and I wouldn't call it like wasted a lot of time, but I was very fixated on the idea of just like being able to release this form of glaze out of the mold, right? And I was like, well, like this is taking a lot of time. It would work with some glazes, but it wouldn't work with others. And I really wanted to get into like the sculptural part of it. So that's when I started like dipping my toes with the saws, and I started with a tile saw, and that would allow me to make little things, right? And then I realized that you could rent concrete saws from Home Depot, and like glaze and concrete and tile are more or less similar. Like concrete is softer than glaze, especially because I work with high fire glaze, and that really gets like stone. So I started dipping my toes into that, and I realized that it also let me access another part that I was very curious and interested about, which is stone carving. Because, and when I talked about the material, um get like working with the material as if it were language. So when I came to the US about 8 or 9 years ago, I realized that speaking English more often and like making it my daily language would start creating changes, not only in the way that I would like react to things or maybe even think about certain things, but it also started changing certain like aspects of my body or the way that I looked. And I think this happens to a lot of people when like they come to a new country, and you're like trying to adapt in a way. Like, do you have to change certain things about yourself before you find yourself again? And it's like kind of a journey, but it's a circular journey if we go back to the original question. But anyway, I digress. Yes, this happens a lot to me. uh so um, so I was thinking about language, and I was thinking about how could you talk about it with material, because I am very interested in material metaphor and collaborating with materials, not only ceramics, but a lot of other ones. So I realized that glaze, when you cast it and then carve it, it becomes something else. So the glaze stops being a thing that gives a quality to an object. So it stops being like something that makes something shiny, or something that makes something blue, or like stuff like that, or something that sits or decorates or like works as the skin of the object, right? And now glaze becomes the object, and by becoming the object, it becomes something else. It becomes this kind of rock. And I started experimenting with different glazes, and I started carving it and polishing it and just discovering all of these new qualities of it, that it just like really it still amazes me how much it can speak. And it's not really about teaching it a new language. It's more like discovering all of the languages that it can speak. And when you, like, for example, in those pieces that you were talking about, which is called it's banderas or flags, because it's green, white, and red, which is the flag of Mexico. um, you can see there the both qualities that we know about glaze so far, which are like this goopy thing that flows and pulls and does these, like, like we know that well. But you can also see that other quality of this material, that it almost looks like marble. And you can see where it cracks and creates this like really sharp edges, but you can also see where it's polished and it's soft. And yes, I just like, I'm really amazed about this quality, and I keep finding more things about it. But I think it's also the process that I'm really enamored with, in a way. It's a lot of labor, but in that labor, like, I have been able to find a voice. I have been able to also find myself here in the United States. It has been like a process that has taken a lot of years, but I feel like I'm finally coming out of it, and being myself again, like the self that I came here with. And that has been I don't know, this word has been used a lot, but that has been my journey with this process, really.
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about your biography and your backstory. You're born in Mexico, but your dad is Italian. So you've done a lot of, I guess, living back and forth. And then now you live in the US. So you kind of have a triangle of language and of experience. So can you talk a little bit more about growing up in Mexico and the art that you saw there and also in Italy?
Yeah, so my dad emigrated to Mexico in the late 70s, late middle 70s, let's call it. So he's been in Mexico for over 40 years, 50 years actually. So it was always, it came like a natural thing for us to go visit our family, and the language part, it's very present in my work and in my life, to be able to go back and forward between, in the beginning, two languages. We would go once a year, and I think I have to say that it's a privilege to be able to do these things, and it's a privilege to have been raised in a family that like that had the opportunity to do that. We would go back and forward all the time, and both my parents are archaeologists, so they were always very interested in taking us to museums and taking us to archaeological sites. And when I was a kid, I just didn't understand it. I was bored. My mom and dad would take us out on vacation, and I'm doing air quotes here, you cannot see it for the people listening, but they would take us on vacation, and it would be to an archaeological site. And my sister and I were like kids. We were like under 10 years old, and we were just bored out of our minds, because we would go to another place that had rocks stacked on top of themselves, and we just couldn't understand it then. Like, and my parents would spend hours talking in front of this wall, and we would just be running around, which, like, now I understand like how much of, again, a privilege that was, to be able to go to an archaeological site or a museum and just wander around and just discover it that way. I wish I would have understood it better then, but I was also a child, so we would be very much in touch with these things, especially the archaeological side of it. They would take us to all of these museums, and then when I became a teenager, I think around 16, 15 or 16, I started becoming more and more interested in the art side of it. And that's when I started wondering more about how, like, drawing and painting. Like, I wanted to paint in the beginning, And actually, I didn't go to college for art for my first year. I went for Italian literature. I wanted to be a translator and a literary critic, which I think it's again, circle, because now I interpret interpretation and translation for an arts organization in Chicago. So like, again, like, I don't know, I just, like, this shape keeps presenting, and again, I'm digressing, I'm sorry everybody, but
No,
going
no.
back to, it is a circle, and we go back to things. And this is what I tell, like, I work with students now at this moment, and I keep telling them, don't abandon something, just put it in a drawer if it's not working right now, because I assure you, you will go back to it. It is a circle, and you will go back to it, a different person, and it will work then. You just have to wait for the right time.
Those are wise words. I've also I've also heard you describe it is that in your own work is that you'll often cannibalize the work. It was interesting though when you talked about it. You said that it's not that the work wasn't good; it's that you changed from the time it was made to the time you use it again, and because you changed, you want something different from the work, which I thought that was interesting. This idea of an ever-changing aesthetic, because we kind of think of ourselves, or at least in the studio pottery world, people think of an aesthetic as being a little more stable, and I like that with you that your aesthetic is a completely evolving thing with every moment.
Well, I think I embrace the intersection of my life, my personal life, my development as a human being, and my studio practice. I don't think that they can be separated. And I am very aware of how much I am changing and how much I am transforming with everything. I find a lot of freedom into just throwing myself into this idea of, like, things are going to change, nothing is permanent, and have your priorities straight, right? So going back to this cannibalizing the work, yes, I also find that work to be very interesting. Cannibalizing, it's just like this idea of, it's almost like eating myself. It's like
Mhm.
self-cannibalizing, because every work is an extension of myself, of what I'm interested in, of what I'm thinking, of what I'm feeling. It can, to me, again, to me, I'm sure that there's people out there that think differently, but to me, it cannot be separated. So of course, when I make a piece and it doesn't leave the studio, or it leaves, it goes, it travels and comes back, and it stays in a shelf, like, of course, after a while, when I have changed, when something in the process can change, when something has developed, when something has become better too, because the more, like, you work with something, the better you get at it, the more you understand it, right? I think, well, that could change, that could be better, or maybe it's just an impulse, and it's like, well, that could transform. So I take the piece, or I refire it, I add things, or I out flat just break it and use it in something else, which is like, glaze can always be melted again. It's like metal almost. It's like a foundry. It can always be melted again and become something else, which, it's a beauty. There's a beauty in it too. And like, now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like I need to toy more with this thought later. But yeah, something that can be, it's like melting keys and making them into a statue or something. I feel like that example comes to me because that's something that they did in my hometown in Mexico. They melted keys and then made a statue out of them. They asked people to come and bring their keys, and then which is kind of poetic, like, to bring this object that opens doors, they melt them all together and then make something out of it.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com. Well, you mentioned that your original first year of study was actually Italian literature. And I wonder what role romance plays and I mean romance in the not person-to-person romance, but the idea of a romantic notion plays with your work. Because I don't see that much sentimentality in your work, because it seems like you're very direct with material. But do you find that that there is some romantic sense in terms of the literature sense that is informing your work today?
Oh, yes, definitely. Like I'm not, I think I'm like in a period of my life where reading is dedicated more to art theory and students' papers. But I really like to read. I love poetry. I love fiction. I am a really big fan of Roberto Bolaño, who was a Chilean, is that how you say it? Chilean?
Yeah, Chilean. Mhm.
Writer, of Borges from Argentina, of Rulfo from Mexico. Like I am an avid reader of a lot of Latin American writers and a lot of poetry. I think that when I found the poetry of Rilke, the German poet, he writes so much about, I don't know, like it just opens so many doors of thought for me. And I use literature as an image. So I would a phrase, a sentence, a word that opens up for me so many avenues and so many meanings of the work. It's like I was saying earlier, I make on an impulse, I make on a thought, and then when the work is presented to me, I understand what it's trying to tell me. I understand what the original intention was. I understand a lot of those things. And I think that also through literature, those doors of meanings open themselves to me. So right now, for example, for the past couple years, there is it's not exactly a poem from Jorge Luis Borges, but it's he's talking about time and what he thinks about time. So the original writing is el tiempo, what is it? I don't have it right now, but it's like time. Oh, el tiempo es una sustancia que me consume. Es un río que me arrebata, pero yo soy el río. Es un tigre que me destroza, pero yo soy el tigre. It's like time is a substance that consumes me. It's a river that takes me away, but I am the river. It's a tiger that tears me apart, but I am the tiger. And that to me, like, I feel like, and this is the thing, like I understand it through feeling, through a raw, visceral feeling. And that's what I want. That's what I want to feel, when I make my work. So that's what literature gives me. It gives me the words to describe this visceral feeling. So that writing from Borges has been driving my making for the past couple years, and it has also been driving the understanding of myself here and now, and like the person that I have become.
So, with your parents being archaeologists, they're often looking at objects from the past and interpreting them. They're piecing together a story based on what we know now. And I think that's very similar to the way that we build identity, because you can look back at an event in your personal life and say that shaped me, but in the moment, you don't know. Like you're just living and that's it. So can you talk a little bit more about how you structure your sense of self as an artist and just as a person today?
Well, that's quite the question. I am not and this is funny because yes, my parents my parents specialize, like they have through their career, they have done different things, but now they specialize in prehistoric sites. So they actually look at broken pieces of obsidian, and they can tell that this was this arrowhead and it had this shape, or like they can look at a piece of rock and say, oh, that was used for this thing, right? Like they can identify those things. And a lot of it, and my dad would say this, a lot of it is interpretation. Like they are working from, like, not the original intention or ideas, but from what they think it was. And this also I think applies a lot to my work. Again, like I excavate it and then interpret it, so it's more like I'm an archaeologist of my own practice, right? Like I'm like, okay, so when Renata was making this, we think that maybe this is what she meant. So it's like quite interesting. So I find myself not very often thinking about the past, like my past. And I don't I'm not sitting around and thinking, oh man, like I remember when I did that, or remember when this happened, like this really shaped my life. It's more like it's flashbacks. And I might be doing something, and then all of a sudden this image comes back to me, and I feel the significance of that. I think that's the way that it presents itself to me, this like reinterpreting the past and interpreting our past selves. Like, and of course, like this is not to say that I never think about it. It's more like I don't I don't feel like I do very much. It's more like these flashbacks that come to me, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. Like that really felt good, or that really felt bad, or like, oh, yeah, that actually shaped a lot of things that I do now. I more think about it when I like do things like this, like talking about the work, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it. I think it's good to do it. I think it's important to do it. But when you asked that question, I was like, actually, I don't really think about that a lot, but maybe I should. That's another good thing to think about. Yes.
Well, I think what you're describing is the difference between intuition, which is an ever present moment that moves with us, and thinking about something in retrospect, which we often have to do when we write. So when you're writing about your work, that's when you kind of have to say, what does this actually mean to me? But the thought processes are so different. You know, like I'm very interested in how people harness their intuition, because I think everyone in the world has intuition, but most people just discount it altogether. They just don't think their thoughts are that important or that their connections are that important. But in your work, I can physically see the connection. Like you're actually usually making tubes that connect to other things, and connection between thoughts and ideas seems to become physical in your work.
Yeah, I think but when you were talking, I was thinking about a thought that I had the other day. And in my work, there's a lot of portals. Like there's a lot of arches, and there's a lot of tubes also connecting. Like there's a lot of connecting things, right? And a lot of portals. And I was thinking about these portals and these tubes as representations of the things that we understand first with our, and to use like, this is the image that comes to me, that we first understand with our gut, like when you feel something, which is like what you were talking, like intuition, which intuition, it's really only the memory of experience. Like it's because I have experienced this before that I'm feeling like I should do this, or I shouldn't do this, or this is the way to go. And that's my theory. It's not written anywhere. Well, I don't think so, but maybe. Anyway, I feel like intuition is the memory of experience. And there's a lot of those connections, those portals to me in the work represent those things that we feel, that we understand first through our gut, through our feeling, and that then we conceptualize, we understand later. But it's the more that we go through these portals, the more that we make these connections, the more we understand them. So I think through my process, through my practice, through my life, there's a lot of that, like just experience things, go through them, and understand them through that, which I don't know. Again, a flashback brought me to that thing that people say all the time, that the only way out is through.
Sure.
But I mean, I don't know. Now that I'm digressing again, Ben. Oh, man.
This show is all about tangents, so feel free to go in any direction you want to go.
Because now I'm thinking that is the only way out through? Like, couldn't you go around it? I don't know. So all of these things come to my mind a lot, and that's why a conversation takes a long time for me.
Well, let's add in your teaching and working with students. I think when you're 18, 19, 20, and you're a student and you're trying to learn, you're also trying to figure out who you are through the process of being in college. But I think what you're talking about is that process never ends. You know, when you're 30, you feel like you don't know yourself and you're getting to know yourself better. When you're 40, you feel like you're getting to know yourself a little bit better. I imagine when I'm turned 50, I'll feel that same way. So how do you talk to students about sort of using art, the skills of art, as a way to better understand themselves? Or do you talk to them about that?
Of course I do. So I am 42 now, and I am in a place right now where I understand what I want. It's clear. Like, I feel like I am clear now. And I just wish that I had this clarity when I was in my 20s. But of course that's not the way the process works, because like, if I had this, I don't know. I don't know. Now I'm thinking, like, if I had this clarity, I don't know. I don't know. And actually I am here, and everything that I have done has brought me here, and that's okay. Like, I have this clarity now. That's the process that I had to go through, and it brought me here, and that's great. But I do, yes, to go back to your question, I do talk to the students a lot about understanding themselves as artists. When I work with undergrads, I more want them to understand, if they come to my ceramic classes, I want them to understand themselves through this material that they have chosen. I always tell them, you're here in ceramics because you like clay, because you want to work with clay. So let's talk about why clay. Like, what is it about clay that you're responding to? What is it about clay that you want to say? So I want them to understand that, and experiment and expand their vocabulary with the material as much as possible. And I definitely, being true to myself, tell them that after the firing, they can still modify the work. Like, the firing is not the final thing. So I want them to expand their horizons and not be limited to certain things, because that's the way we also advance, right? Advance as human beings, advance in the field, advance in the arts, like, just like, and also especially in the arts, like, not being limited with things. It's just like expanding and trying, and I'm in a way being a little bit of is a transgressor, like, oh, this is the rule, let me break it and see what happens. I always tell them, push the line. Like, where is your line? Okay, so now cross it, now push it. Was that too much? Okay, now you can come back. If the water was not what you wanted over there, you can come back over here. But if you pushed it and over there you found something exciting, well, just keep swimming and see where that takes you. Like, that's what I tell with especially with the undergrads. With the grad students, I think it's a little bit more I wish I knew this when I was in grad school as well, but again, this is where we are, and everything brought me here. But I tell them, you are here to understand your practice better and your process better. And if you come out from this 3 years, because here it's 3 years, understanding that, it has been successful. Because I have seen it a lot, like, students come in making a certain kind of work, and then they like go a completely 360, but then not 360, 180. And then by the time they're ending, they went 360 actually, and they're making the same work. Again, the circle, you see? But what I tell them is, you are a different person now. So the work might be the technique, the process might be the same, but you have changed. So the work has changed too. Maybe you understand it better. Maybe you understand your process and how you work better, because I believe that a lot of, we would save a lot of pain and heartache if we just understood ourselves and our process and threw ourselves into that. Like I always and right now, and my students will be like, oh my God, you have to shut up about this. But I'm like, how do you understand the work? Do you make it and then understand it? Or do you understand what you want to do and then execute? Like, that is so basic. But if you like, I need time after I make the work to understand it. There's people, I have colleagues that have an idea, make it, and like they know exactly what it is. So like if we, and this is obviously not two opposite things. Like I believe it's a spectrum. So you can sit anywhere in the spectrum, like where you feel like where it is. But if we understand that, and that's what I tell grad students, if you come out from here understanding that part about yourself, this has been already a success, because then you will know how to how your practice, like the basic fundamentals of your practice. I don't know, did I answer your question? I feel like I went on many tangents.
You did. And I'm glad you brought in grad students, because the older I get, the more I see that undergraduate and graduate schools are not that similar. Like what you want out of what people need out of undergrad is skills. Like they need to know how to do things. And in graduate school, it's so much more about refining a sense of self, like you said, like understanding what your decisions are and why you make them. Like all these things, it's just a totally different ball game. But can you talk a little bit about where you teach and the environment you guys have there?
Well, I teach at the School of Art of the University of Arkansas. I've been here for about 4 to 5 years. We just moved into a brand new facility, so we are kind of finding ourselves in this new facility, new program. We have a very hefty undergraduate program, especially in the in ceramics. Like we have a lot of students. A lot of students want to try wheel throwing. A lot of students want to try hand building. So that is very good. Like we have a lot of students that are very interested in it. For me, what it's really rewarding is that we are in an area of Arkansas and of the country where there's a lot of migrants from Mexico and Central America. So for me to be able to connect to these students and to be able to connect them to maybe something that by being here in the US, they don't have maybe the opportunity to talk about it or to connect and like teaching them in Spanish too, like that has been very personally rewarding for me. What I like about the undergraduate program here too is the foundations. It's a little bit different than other schools that I have been in. And we have a class called Creative Thinking that I really enjoy teaching. It's really expanding the students' conceptions and ideas of art, and like just making them try things and taking them out of their comfort zone and making them like think about art in a different way. I really like that class because it just lends itself for a lot of intuitive work and a lot of seeing the students discover themselves in a different way. And I think that's what I like about teaching is seeing the students discover themselves. And I have to say, I mean, going back to a lot of like visual metaphors that we have been talking about the river, I tell my students at the end of class, I was like, thank you very much for this semester, because I believe that as much as I have taught you, you have taught me. Teaching is a river that flows both ways at the same time. So as much as I hope I have given the students tools and like I have knowledge, they have also given me the tools to understand myself better. So I believe that and this is a recommendation for all the grad students out there listening, even if you're not interested in teaching, just try it once, because for me, it has been a door that has opened so many things about myself and about who I am that I don't know. I think it might have taken a little bit longer to discover if I hadn't gone into teaching, for sure.
I wanted to actually take a tangent. And as you're talking, I'm looking behind you, and you've written part of the poem that you said earlier. I am the river, I am the tiger, I am the fire. So can you just talk about this idea of, or why that's important to you? I'm very interested in how people shape their own studio spaces.
So I said, as we talked about, vocabulary words important, not interesting, are important to me. I used to have a wall full of words. I would listen to a word and I would be like, that word is important. And I would write it down and put it on the wall of my studio. Literature, these visual metaphors that you create with words. And I don't remember, it's an American writer. I don't remember his name right now, but he wrote that writing is just as making a sculpture. Like you sculpt with words. A sentence becomes a sculpture in itself. For me, these things are really important to understand how these words, what the weight of these words are, what the shape of these words are. In the case of Borges's poem, or not, it's not a poem, we have established that. In the case of Borges's writing, I am this image of something that it's tearing you apart, but it's yourself. It's just so true. Like we are the ones taking ourselves away. We are the ones tearing ourselves apart, and we are the ones building ourselves back up. So for me, that just like it's really a driver of life. It's like, and it's also, I don't know, I just feel such a passion when I think about it, that it's also hard to describe with words. Again, the person that is so interested in words, it lacks words, but that those are the contradictions. And I think that writing also talks about that contradiction. It's like it's a tiger that is tearing me apart, but I am that tiger. And it's this thought about things are not opposing. Like things, we think very much in binaries, especially Western thought is very binary. It's like one or the other, and they are opposing. And actually, they exist at the same time. And actually, there's a third one and a fourth one. So to be able to, and this is what I'm working in, it's like try to deconstruct this idea in myself of these, it's one or the other. And it's more like actually just throw yourself into it because it's all of it at the same time. And that is the beauty of it. And the more that we relax and flow with this idea, I think the more that we're going to open up in not only in our lives, in our works as artists, in our works as educators, and everything. I think that just to be able to free yourself of this idea of opposing things, like we're both the tiger that is tearing us apart, and like the person that is being teared up, like, and I yes, I think yes, that.
Well, it reminds me of some work that you made that actually, in this case, it was figurative work, but you talked about the reference was the god of transformation.
Xipetotec.
Yeah, Shipatotec. And just this idea of constant transformation being positive, that like that cycle of rebirth, death, rebirth, death, like that is actually good. That's not something to fight against. Because I think that sometimes as artists, when I see young students that it can't go with the flow, like they're so holding tight to one idea of who they are that they just stop themselves and they end up leaving art. Like I think this idea of constant flow and change, like this is being an artist. Like you kind of have to embrace this if you're going to do this as a livelihood.
Yeah, I think, yes, that's very true. Xipetotec is, I'm moving now between Xipetotec and Tezcatlipoca, but the smoking mirror is his name. But yeah, they're both talking about transformation. They're both representing like the shifts of our lives. And I don't, it's just like if we just throw ourselves into it, I think things would be easier. And you talk about the students, and I see it too, especially with the undergrads. If a sculptor, they have this idea of like failure being a bad thing. And if a project they're working on doesn't come out exactly how they wanted, they just like lose it. And they think that, and I think also when you're an undergrad, like the grades are so important. And of course they are, because like their scholarships and all of that depends on their grade, which I mean, that's a different conversation and we're going to leave it for another time. But what I tell my students is like, I am not going to grade you on the success of your work. I am going to grade you on how much you threw yourself, how much you committed to the process. And if you fail, that's okay. But that failure needs to be, how do you call, like preceded?
Mm-hmm.
That the word needs to be preceded by a commitment to this project, to this idea. Like if you fail because you started this project 2 days before, then that's on you. But if it failed because you were too ambitious, you didn't know what you were doing, but you did it anyway, you tried something very experimental, that's good failure. That's the failure that brings opportunities. But so that's what I tell my students is like, don't be too worried about the result. Let's just focus on what's happening through the making of it and what we can discover through it. Of course, like there's certain things that they need to learn, like the basics of the technique, like all of these things we work through. But to me, it's very important to also thread in this idea of expanding your horizons, expanding your limits, pushing the limits a little bit to be able to find who you are through this whole process, because that's also what being an artist is. It's not just about the product, but it's about how you got to it.
To wrap up, can you leave your social media so people could get in touch if they wanted to talk a little bit more about this?
Yes, I have Instagram only at Renata Cassiano, RenataCassiano.
Also, can you plug the website for potential grad students that might want to study with you?
It's York Ceramics if you want for ceramics, or just York Art if you're interested in. We have a multidisciplinary program, so students can move around from areas to areas, and they can we have had ceramic grads that their thesis work has not had ceramics at all. So that's that possibility. Again, finding yourself, that's important. So York Art, I believe the deadline is January 15th. And we will be doing a couple of info sessions, so just be on the lookout for that. York Art or York Ceramics, UARC. Yes.
Well, thanks so much. This has been a pleasure. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. This was good. Yeah, there's a lot of things that I am thinking about now, actually.
Good. I'd like to thank Renata for coming on the show. It was nice to see her and chat with her again. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Michiana Pottery Tour, which is happening this weekend, September the 23rd and 24th, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch through our network website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. Also wanted to mention, if you would like to support this show or any of our shows on the network, if you can leave us a rating and review, that helps us go up the iTunes, or as they now call it, the Apple Podcast charts. So if you got some time, just click it right on your podcast app or on Spotify, any of the podcast apps you listen from, and leave us a rating and review. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.